Good evening and welcome to the Steps Travel Instagram Live interview. For us at Steps, travel isn't simply about places and destinations. It's about people and about getting to know them better. Unconditional and often unplanned moments that create connections. Trust in strangers is the very essence of travel, and the kindness of strangers are a reaffirmation that people are on the whole good, a reason for hope. And in our series of conversations with photographers, writers, historians, travellers, we aim to explore this a bit further. And tonight I'm delighted to have with us British polar explorer, author, speaker and research scientist, Felicity Aston MBE. Now let me just try and get Felicity on board. Felicity, I think you're there.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi. Yes, I can hear you. Fantastic to hear you.
I'm very well, thank you. But you don't see. Ah, there I am. Hello.
Yeah, there you are. There you are. Now, Felicity, if I may, thank you very much for joining us. But I'm just going to read an excerpt from your website, if I may, which starts, as well as being the first woman to ski across Antarctica alone, you've raced in the Canadian Arctic, led teams of women across the inland ice of Greenland, and on scientific missions across remote Icelandic glaciers. You've led record-making international teams to the North and South Poles, searched for meteorites, craters in Quebec, skied along a frozen river in Siberia, traversed the winter ice of Lake Baikal, worked on a nuclear-powered icebreaker in the North Pole, walked the Zanskar Valley, driven 36,000 kilometers across Eurasia to the coldest inhabited place in the world, searched for gold in the Yukon, driven 6,000 kilometers across Antarctica, flown in an airship across America, and completed the Marathon des Sables. And spent 3 years living and working in Antarctica.
Well, that makes me feel tired when you read it like that all at once.
That's hugely impressive. I don't know, where do we start? I know that you divide your time between Vigo Island and also the National Oceanographic Centre here in the UK. And I know that I believe you are.
I am,
yes. At the moment.
It looks like I'm sort of in a chalet in the Alps somewhere, but no, I'm sitting right in the northwest of Iceland in a fjord called Ísafjarðardjúp. So if you permit me to turn my phone round, I can show you the view out of my window right now. You can just about see the glaciers. I'm just a stone's throw from the Arctic Circle here, so we're at 66 degrees north, and it really feels like another world.
Well, you describe it as a slice of northern perfection. So tell us more about it. Don't show us again or make us too envious of where you are, but just tell us a bit about it.
It's a tiny little island that's only 2 kilometers long and no more than half a kilometer wide at any point. And we sit in the middle of this big fjord in a very remote northern region of Iceland. The West Fjords of Iceland only get visited by about 9% of the people that visit Iceland as a total. So not many people make it right up here. And we're closer to Greenland than we are to Europe. So Greenland is just over the horizon. And myself and my husband and my little boy, who's 6 years old, came here 4 years ago. And the island was put up for sale by the previous owners. And there were various things that were going to happen to the island, and we knew it already. We'd visited here because of all the bird life and stunning wildlife that's here. And we were very concerned for its future. And then there sort of came a point where we thought, well, we know what we would like the future of this place to be. So maybe we need to be the ones to make sure it has that future. So we had an opportunity to make a bid to take over the island. And eventually the previous owners said they were not going to sell to anyone but me and Gisli because they liked what we wanted to do with the place. So yeah, so we came here 4 years ago, and it's been a huge learning curve ever since, trying to get to learn everything that you need to. There's no manual for owning an island. So you kind of have to sort of come here and work it all out for yourself.
Well, you mentioned bird life. I understand that you have over 100,000 puffins, and you have several thousand eider ducks as well. And that you, if I'm right, you collect the down of the ducks. And if my reading was right, I think 3,000 kilograms of eider down are produced a year, 85% of which is from Iceland, which makes about 3,000 duvets. And there on the island, you collect what, 50 kgs a year, is that right? From about, well, 60 nests is 1 kg. So if my maths is right, that's sort of well, how many? That's 3,000 nests that you have to visit to collect the eiderdown. How do you do it?
Yeah, it's a really traditional way of collecting a natural material. So, and it's a waste material. So the eider ducks gather around the shore of Viga at the beginning of May. We have about 10,000 eider ducks, common eider, that turn up here, and they can nest anywhere they like on the island. And when we walk around the island and see where some of the nests are, you do wonder about their decision-making process. You know, we find them half hanging off the edge of cliffs in the middle of an open beach in the most inaccessible parts of the island that are far away from the water. But yes, as you say, once the eggs start hatching out, they don't need the warmth of that eiderdown in the nest anymore. So that's when we can go around the island, and we methodically go around the island section by section, finding each of those nests. And we have some 3,500. So it's hard work to find them all, and then make sure that you are only taking the eiderdown at the right time, because if we take the eiderdown too soon, we could affect the outcome of those eggs. But if we leave it too late, then the ducks leave and the eiderdown gets blown out to sea and there's nothing left to collect. So we go around the island about 3 times in total before we've collected in all of the eiderdown. And that harvest process takes place throughout June. And then we spend the rest of the year cleaning that eiderdown. So we bring in about 300 kilograms from the field, but it's mixed in with straw and hay. So we have various processes that we put that down through until it's clean, and we end up with between 50 and 60 kilograms depending on the year. But the income from the eiderdown is the main income of the island, as it has been for centuries. So this is something that we're called eider farmers, which I think is a bit misleading, because we don't farm the ducks, we don't feed or breed anything here. They're all wild ducks that just happen to like nesting on our island. And so it's this wonderful sort of relationship of mutual benefits. You know, the ducks have learned that they are safest when they are closest to human beings, which is unusual in the natural world. Usually it's the exact opposite. Wildlife wants to be as far away from human beings as possible, but they've learned that they're safest when they're closest to human beings. And then our benefit is that it means that we have a very dense kind of collection of nests, so it makes it easier to collect the eiderdown. So it's a rather, yeah, lovely sort of relationship between man and wild duck, and it's almost uniquely Icelandic. So there are a few other pockets around the world that do this. Other parts of Scandinavia, parts of northern Siberia, but really this is the only place where it's sort of established itself into this industry, and it's really quite amazing.
Well, how wonderful, how fascinating. So as well as an eider farmer, is that right? Eider farmer, you're also a speaker and author. And I think one of your more recent books is the Life Lessons from Explorers. Without giving away too many secrets of the book, because obviously everybody listening has to go and buy your book and books, but also come and listen to you speak at some point. What are some of the life lessons that you talk about from explorers when you do speak or in the book itself?
Yeah, well, so there's 15 chapters, and each chapter focuses on a different explorer and then looks at a different characteristic that's exemplified by that explorer. And I sort of explore their story and also, you know, what we can learn from their achievements, but also their failures. And that was one of the biggest lessons that I learned. I talked about some very famous explorers, people like Amundsen and Shackleton, who are kind of known for their success and their amazing kind of ability to pull through in disaster. But the point that I make is that when you read their diaries, when you read their letters, you know, it's very easy to look back in history and think, oh, they knew what they were doing, and, you know, they were always so confident. But actually, you know, they were racked with self-doubt and the same demons and voices of insecurity that all of us are racked with. And I think, you know, that's a really important thing to remember when we face challenges in life. I think all too often we beat ourselves up because maybe we didn't know what to do, or we made the wrong decision, but then you think, well, these people that's, you know, these huge heroes, they did the same. You know, they weren't superheroes. They were normal human beings, and they made the same mistakes as the rest of us. But you know, what was it that made them different? And some of my favorite stories in the book are ones that perhaps people don't know about, and that was a real honor to be able to bring these stories in front of a bigger audience. I mean, I'm sitting in Iceland now, so maybe I should mention Gudrun, the far-traveled, who was a Viking woman, an Icelandic woman, who lived in the late 800s. And she was one of the first Europeans to travel to the New World, to travel to what we now know as North America. And she was the first woman to have a child, a European child, in North America. And I talk about resilience sort of through her experiences. You know, what made her so resilient? What made her survive all those incredible journeys across the North Atlantic and live to a ripe old age for the time and travel across Europe to meet the Pope and become a very powerful, wealthy woman, influential woman in her own right here in Iceland? You know, what made her resilient? What made her so successful? And trying to sort of unpick those stories and then try and translate that to our own lives. You know, well, what of that is relevant to us today? And you know, perhaps fortunately for me, just after that book was published, we went into the massive lockdown of the pandemic, and you know, this idea of resiliency and flexibility and adaptability and self-sufficiency, you know, all of this was suddenly hugely relevant to us in a modern setting. So it was a really interesting time to be writing a book like that too.
And in your own travels, you're an explorer. You've got the polar medal. Do you take solace from the fact that Amundsen and Shackleton were racked by this self-doubt, by the resilience of others? Do you draw on some of those stories in your own travels, or you've got your own life lessons from your own travels?
For sure. I mean, I draw inspiration from all sorts of different things, but yes, it's really reassuring to know that, for example, the story of Shackleton. You know, his expedition was a total disaster. You know, he went to cross the Antarctic continent on foot for the first time, and he didn't even make landfall before his ship was crushed in the ice. And then suddenly he has all his men stranded out on the ice of the Weddell Sea. And he would have been absolutely aware that there weren't many expeditions that had survived such a situation in the history of exploration to that point. So, I mean, what must have been going through his head? And you know, when you read his diaries, what was going through his head was, oh my God, I've led all these men to their deaths. What am I going to do now? I mean, obviously, we now know that he oversaw one of the most remarkable stories of survival and journeying in the polar regions that there's ever been in exploration. But of course, he didn't know that at the time. And I think, you know, for all of us, it's easy to look back on your life and see this wonderful thread going from one thing to the other. I mean, I'm often asked, what led you to be an explorer? You know, how did you decide to be an explorer? And I think, gosh, I'm not sure I ever did decide to be an explorer. It just, you know, now it all seems to have followed this wonderful path. But when you're traveling through it, you can't see the next step. You can't see ahead. You have to make the trail as you go. And you know, I find that really fascinating when you look back at some of these historical stories, to try and really put yourself in the shoes of those people at that moment. And I think that really enables you to appreciate how brave and how courageous they were, and that therefore by association, how brave and courageous we all have the potential to be.
I like that potential to be. So Shackleton's sort of famous for his teamwork and bringing the team together to get through the fact that the Endurance was crushed in the ice, etc. And in 2009, if I got my date right, you led a group of young women from the sort of Commonwealth countries to Antarctica. They came from different backgrounds and you wrote about it in your book, Call of the White, but they came from different backgrounds, from sort of Jamaica, from Singapore, Cyprus. Some of whom, if I'm right, that they certainly hadn't seen snow and ice before, and some had never been in a tent before. So how did you bring this group of women together, and sort of how did it all unfold? I know, again, I've got to read the book, and others have to read the book. Call of the White is the book, but can you just give a brief?
Yes. So I mean, I set out to create a team that was deliberately as little like the image that pops into your head when you hear the word polar explorer as it was possible to get. So my team were from, as you say, countries like Brunei Darussalam, which is a tiny country on the island of Borneo. They were all Commonwealth countries. That was the thread that sort of brought them all together, and we made the expedition in the 60th anniversary year of the Commonwealth, which is an association of 50 odd countries that all have some kind of history or relationship with the UK in the past. And of these women, the majority of them had never spent a night in a tent, never put on a pair of skis. I think it was probably in 2 cases in the final team, they'd seen snow in films and in photographs, but they came from the tropics where, you know, there was no reason for them to have experienced sub-zero temperatures. And yet, despite that, you know, the motivation for doing that was to prove something, was to prove what I believe absolutely, you know, to the core, which is that, you know, whatever you set your heart on doing, if you have that motivation, if you have the motivation up here to do something, you will find a way to make it work one way or another. So we set about sort of learning all the skills and knowledge that we needed in order to make this journey to the South Pole. But more importantly, we sort of built the confidence in each other, but in ourselves as well, that was needed in order to make that journey, because I was adamant that in setting out to ski to the South Pole, we didn't want to do it if we weren't sure that we could do it, because if something goes wrong in that sort of environment, it involves asking other people to come and rescue you, and therefore putting their lives at risk. So, you know, I wanted to be sure that we had the confidence to do it and to get ourselves to the South Pole. You know, this wasn't a guided expedition. This wasn't us being led by somebody else. This was us in developing ourselves into a team and as individuals that were capable of making this journey and making it in a good style. And we did. We made that journey, which was just over 900 kilometers, and we made that in about 38 days, which you know, is very respectable. So I'm very proud of that photo of us all at the South Pole having made that journey, more so because of where we started, which was as a group of people who had never done anything like this before.
And so we can read about it in Core of the White. Is there a
There was a documentary film made about it, and a DVD that got broadcast in several countries that were involved in that expedition, and it's still on a DVD if anyone has a DVD player anymore or ability to play DVDs, but it is still out there. And then of course, sort of 10 years later, I did something very similar but to the North Pole, and that was with a team of women from across Europe and the Middle East. And that was also made, we wrote a book about it called Polar Exposure, and it's also made into a documentary film that is currently doing the rounds at film festivals and things, so do look out for it. It's called Exposure.
Exposure, yeah. No, I've been looking out for that. But sort of just winding back again, so 3 years after doing this with this group of women, in 2012 you set off by yourself. So you obviously sort of were fed up with other people.
It was
no, but you walked some over 1,700 kilometers, took 59 days in doing, set a world record, Guinness World Record, and you were the first woman to walk across Antarctica. And you wrote about it in your book, Alone, is that, or no? Alone, yes. So how was that? It must have been very different from working with the team and having people all around you to being totally by yourself. And how did you cope mentally with that? And
yes, well, I mean, you know, after doing 10 years or more of team expeditions, I was really aware of how much determination and motivation and self-discipline I derive from that team around me, because particularly when you're in a leadership role, you largely don't have a choice but to bring your best self every day. You know, if I'd woken up in that tent on the way to the South Pole and, you know, just stayed in my sleeping bag, or, you know, burst into tears and sort of, and dissolved into panic, or, you know, the team would have lost confidence in me and the project would have fallen apart. And so, you know, you have that constant reason to bring your best self every single day. And, you know, I was curious about, okay, well, if I take that away, what is left? You know, am I still capable of doing this if I'm on my own? And what does it feel like to be out in an environment like Antarctica all by yourself, you know, without that fallback? And, you know, I thought I'd gone to Antarctica supremely well prepared for the solitude and the isolation. But in the first few seconds of that expedition, I realized that I wasn't prepared at all. And I remember so well sort of standing there watching that plane leave me, and that feeling of terror kind of settling onto my shoulders. And then that feeling didn't leave me for the entire 2 months or so that I was skiing across the Antarctic landmass. So it was a real journey in learning how to be with myself, you know, which sounds utterly bizarre, doesn't it? But people live entire lifetimes without ever spending any real time just with themselves, and it was a really eye-opening experience. So that book doesn't really describe the physical journey, and, you know, some people were quite annoyed with me on reading the book. They're like, but you didn't put a list of equipment, or you didn't put maps in it. And no, I didn't. So if you want maps and lists of equipment, that's not the book for you. But what I did try and do was to describe that psychological journey, because it changed. It wasn't just that in the first couple of days I found some coping mechanisms and then that was me sorted for the rest of the trip. It was, I changed, the challenge changed, the way I coped with those challenges changed. You know, the things that worked and the things that didn't work, and the things that scared me and the things that made me feel better were different from day to day to day. And I found that really fascinating. You know, once I got home and had the mental and physical energy to really reflect on it, I found it so interesting, and I'm so grateful for having had that opportunity. That's why I decided to write about it, because I hope that others would find it interesting too.
I listened to a TED talk that I think you did a couple of months when you, after that journey, after you come back, and you said that one of the point you say, I'm not brave, but I'm stubborn and tenacious. And you also talk about you want to sort of push yourself and see how far you could go, and then you talk about sort of at the end there's almost was it a sense of anticlimax, but that you had succeeded, so you hadn't failed, and you thought, well, have I pushed myself to the limit? But you said maybe you at the time you were still too close to it, i.e. just 3 months later. But what are your views on it now, and sort of how much you pushed yourself, and would you do something like that again?
Yeah. I remember that talk, and I think actually it was about 3 weeks after I'd come off the ice. It was really soon afterwards. And so when I watch that film now of me speaking, I can see it's almost, you know, trauma that you're seeing. And I'm looking a bit bedraggled, and I'm looking a bit thin and skinny, and you know, I was still a rabbit in the headlights, I think, sort of in shock of everything that I'd just experienced, and I hadn't really processed anything. But yes, when I finished the journey, it was almost that I didn't want to stop skiing to start off with. And then when I did, there was this voice in my head that went, well, Felicity, you could keep skiing, you know. And then the question becomes, well, how long could I have kept skiing for? Could I have skied for another day, another week? Could I have turned around and gone back across Antarctica? And, you know, there was this feeling of disappointment in a way that, you know, if you haven't failed, then surely you haven't pushed yourself to the limit. But I realized once I returned that I did reach limits on that expedition. It was just that they didn't look the way I thought they were going to. You know, I went with a naive expectation that there's a kind of line in the snow where you drop to your knees and go, right, I can't take another pace. You know, this is it. This is my limit. And I can tell you my limit is so many days or so many miles or, you know, whatever. but it doesn't look like that. You know, I returned with a stronger belief than ever that, you know, we are infinitely resilient. And you hear that in stories of survival, you know, when people suddenly take on superhuman strength to save a loved one in that moment of crisis, or that undergo huge, you know, psychological and physical trauma and yet go on to, you know, lead amazing lives. And you know, and I really believe that in most of our lifetimes, we barely scratch the surface of what we're capable of. But of course, the limit there and the difference is choice. You know, a survival situation is not something you've chosen, whereas these expeditions, that's why I say I'm not brave, because they're things I've chosen to do. You know, I'm there through choice. And therefore I realized on return that my limit is my choice, you know, and I choose not to put myself through something like that again. There were days when I felt like I was losing my mind. You know, I came back with a much healthier respect for my mental well-being and an awareness of how fragile that can be, you know, and if you keep pushing that and pushing that and pushing that, you stand to lose a lot. You know, there were days when I was second guessing myself, where I couldn't rely on my own mind, where, you know, I'd have to go over decisions over and over again to make sure I was making them right. And you know, that felt really scary. And, you know, I don't want to risk my mental health. I don't want to risk that gift that I've been given again. And so no, I won't be going out and doing another solo expedition of that length. But then I'm always wary of saying no, never, because you never know what's around the corner, especially after a good decade or so has passed. But yeah, it was such an interesting experience to go through on so many different levels, and that's why I felt it was important to share it.
Well, but you are planning, or have been planning, another expedition, but it's not, as you say, it's not solo. It's the big expedition, North Pole expedition, big being before it goes. And you were due to go, I think, last year, and then again this year, but you didn't. Or can you tell us why and when you might go again?
Yeah,
or if you think you will
I
go
mean, you know,
again?
every expedition that I've done has been more challenging than the last in some respect or another. But, you know, challenge can come in all sorts of different guises. So it's not just that each expedition is longer or, you know, more extreme in physical conditions. Sometimes it's that your team is more complicated, or the objectives of the expedition are more challenging, or, you know, so I'm someone who gets bored very easily. So, you know, I need that element of challenge, and I need to be going out there. Each of these trips, you need to dedicate 2, 3, sometimes more years of your life. And I'm talking about, you know, this is my full-time everyday job. You know, this is what I spend my life doing. So it has to be something that really grabs you, and I think also an element of scares you. You know, if you're going out there feeling really confident, yeah, I could do this with my eyes shut, then why are you doing it? You know, that's my philosophy anyway. So you know, there has to be something sort of scary about it. And the last 10 years or so, I've been spending more and more time in the Arctic, and really becoming aware of just how rapid the environmental change is in the Arctic, and at the same time how big the gaps are in our knowledge about these systems that are disappearing in front of our eyes. You know, climate change is still so often talked about in terms of a hypothetical future, and yet, you know, not only is it here with us right now today, but it's already in our past. You know, the North Pole, the last time someone was able to ski from land to the North Pole was in 2014. You know, that's nearly a decade ago. And it's arguable whether it's ever going to be possible again. I mean, most people believe it will not be. And if you put that in the context of the first person ever to travel across the surface of the Arctic Ocean to undisputedly stand at the North Pole, that was Sir Wally Herbert in 1969. You know, so in the space of 50 years, we've gone from the first to the last, and we are now in the era of the last. You know, there are people going out increasingly often to be the last person to do this, the last person to do that, which, you know, I think is a bit of a kind of dubious honor. And as it stands today, you know, me and my polar exposure team in 2018, we are among the last to have ever been to the North Pole, because since 2018, it's not been possible to return to that high latitude Arctic Ocean. First there was COVID, And then in 22, we weren't able to go because of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And that was because the logistics heading that took us out to the Arctic Ocean routed out of northern Siberia, and a lot of the flight crew in particular were Ukrainian. So obviously a Ukrainian Russian crew was not going to work at that time, and yeah, there were all sorts of problems. And then this year it was because of the safety of the sea ice and also environmental questions about taking people out onto the sea ice in these big planes, that there wasn't enough permission, so we weren't able to go. So it's arguable, you know, this window that we have to ski to the North Pole is closing really rapidly. And so that's why back in 2019 I started the big North Pole expedition, which stood for Before It's Gone. And at the time I set out just to do one expedition to the North Pole and collect lots of sea ice data as we traveled, because I was aware of how little we knew about sea ice. You know, there's quite some fundamental questions that still have to be answered. But now it's turned into a sort of multi-year pan-Arctic project of a scale that I would never have had the courage to launch at the outset. So now we've made expeditions across glaciers in Iceland and across frozen fjords in Svalbard, and we're hoping to head out to the Arctic Ocean in Arctic Canada next year. And we've been collecting snow and ice samples, so we're looking at things like airborne pollution, so airborne microplastics, and with some scientific partners like Dr. Uliana Horodsky in Colorado, looking at black carbon deposition on sea ice, and all sorts of projects about albedo and Arctic clouds. So we're really trying to maximize the benefit of these last journeys over across the Arctic Ocean.
I want to come back to climate change and to microplastics in a bit. But before, you were talking about something you mentioned about scaring yourself in sort of comfort zones. How would you encourage others to push and nudge their own comfort zones, or what would you say
well,
about
my
that?
guiding principle is that if this is a nagging thought, dream, idea, daydream, nightmare that won't go away, then it's probably quite a good idea and you need to do something about it, because it won't ever go away, you know, and then eventually you'll miss your opportunity. You know, so often I hear people saying, oh, I'm going to wait until XYZ and then I'm going to go to Antarctica, or then I'm going to make that trip of a lifetime, or then I'm going to start that business or learn that language. But you know, there is never a good time to start. There is never the perfect time. You know, I've launched expeditions in global financial meltdowns, in pandemics, you know, in all sorts of times when every time I've launched an expedition, there's been many really good reasons why that wasn't the right time to do it. And yet, you know, if I hadn't had done that, I would be sitting here now with very little to talk to you about. So I think, you know, the big advice that I give people is that if there's that little dream, that ambition that it keeps popping up in your head, you know, make the time to sit down and face it head on and do something about it. And don't start tomorrow, don't start next week, don't start when you turn 21 or whatever. You know, start today, start right now, tell someone about it, write yourself an email, whatever it takes, you know, make that first little step towards making it happen.
I so love that. So Charlie, if you're listening, we are rowing around the UK, and Felix, if you're listening, we are going to do the Thankful Gorges, okay? So we're definitely going to do both of those. But back to climate change, are you positive, or can you be optimistic about it, that we can reduce sort of emissions and keep sea levels or at a level, or are you pessimistic about the future? Where are you?
Well, I mean, you know, I know that we are a tenacious, intelligent, ingenious, brilliant species. I mean, you know, we are capable of such amazing things. And I think it's really important that we remind ourselves of all the stunning things we have accomplished. We're very good at reminding ourselves about how rubbish we are. And undoubtedly, we are a rubbish species at the same time. But, you know, things like the ozone hole, you know, we found a solution and we implemented it. And yep, the ozone hole has not gone away, but, you know, it's a lot better than if we'd done nothing. Carbon is a much more complicated problem. To our dependence on fossil fuels is a lot more complicated, but we already have the solutions. We already have the technology. We already know what we need to do. It's just a matter of doing it. And I think, increasingly, it's going to be out of our hands. We're going to find ourselves in a situation where we have to do something. But what I'm more concerned about is that we start, instead of sort of arguing over what is happening and why it is happening, I really hope that we start to focus more on putting in place those adaptations that we need to make. We know there already is, lots of climate refugees. That's going to become a bigger problem. What are we going to do about that? Let's put in place a really good system so that we don't have the same sort of challenges that we've had in Europe over the last decade with refugees and people that need help. We know this is on our horizon, but things like food supplies, things like when we need vaccines and the production of those vaccines, because we're going to be having different types of illnesses at different types of years, at different time of year, when we start getting less predictable seasons and more extreme weather events. All these things we know are going to happen. So, let's start thinking practically about how we're going to prepare for that, because otherwise we're going to find ourselves always on the back foot, and we're better than that. We can do better.
I think very well said. Very well said. You talked about, you mentioned microplastics earlier on, but you are doing, when you're here in the UK winter, you spend time at the National Oceanographic Centre and studying the amount of microplastics in the Arctic Ocean, or also the Antarctic? At
the moment, it's just studying in the Arctic. But yes, I'm based at the University of Southampton in the National Oceanography Centre, and I'm looking at snow and ice samples from different parts of the Arctic, and looking for microplastic content to really focus on airborne microplastics. So we've become quite used to the idea of marine microplastics, and the Arctic, it seems, is acting as a sort of sink for a lot of that marine microplastic. It's being frozen into sea ice, and then sort of moved around and transported and melting out of the sea ice. So that's something that has been studied for quite a long time, but it's really only relatively recently that we've realized that actually a lot of the microplastic that we're finding on the surface in really remote areas must have been transported there through the atmosphere. So that's part of the area that I'm investigating is, well, how does this microplastic get there? How much of a problem is it, the transport of microplastics through the atmosphere? And, what is the significance of that? And what can we do to perhaps make that better in the future?
And single-use plastic is one of my big bugbears, and as the office of the team here in Steps well know, I always carry a refillable bottle. I use shampoo bars, deodorant bars, etc., etc. What do you do, and what would you advise those listening to reduce their use of single-use plastic?
Well, I mean, there's for sure a lot of great stuff that we can do, and there's a lot of organizations and information out there that give really good practical advice on how you can reduce your consumption of single-use plastics. But I also feel, by the same token, consumers can only do so much, and I think we've reached a point where really industry and government has to step in. We can only do so much as the public. So I think perhaps the most instrumental thing that we can do as individuals right now is to vote in politicians who are serious about sitting down with industry and sorting this out. I find it frustrating that we're now in a situation where, as much plastic that we save and recycle in our households, there are huge companies out there that are producing this stuff faster than we can recycle it or deal with it. So it's time, I think, that that is really taken to task in a proper way. And so I feel personally, my opinion is that the best, most powerful thing we can do right now is to make sure that the people that are able to make those decisions and take those people and those industries to task are put in a position to be able to do that.
great answer, and it certainly resonated by looking at some of the things coming through as we were talking with those listening. So thank you for that. I would so love to spend, I don't know, hours chatting away to you, but you've probably got lots of down to go and collect maybe still, or maybe you've done it already. I have two final questions. The first is with apologies to your husband or your partner and your son. But where are you off to next? What next for you?
Yes. Well, there's always a list of expeditions that are in various and projects that are in various kind of states of reality, from those that are just ideas in my head to ones that are fully funded and ready to go and that have departure dates for. So, and in between those two extremes, there's a whole lot of things. So, you know, I'm writing another book, and I'm focusing on Viga as well, the island here in Iceland, and trying to move it forward towards a place of conservation and research and sort of responsible tourism. And then the big project is ongoing. So that's really the most immediate next thing, is heading out next April on the next phase of the big project. And if anyone would like to follow our progress, they can do that through bignorthpole.com. That's our website, and you can then get to all the other different platforms from there.
Great. And you mentioned Bigger Island again there. Apart from your wonderful home there, and what place are you happiest?
Wherever my family is, you know, just like everyone else. You know, coming to live in a remote island in the middle of a global pandemic when we were isolated here, it really showed me, it demonstrated how little we need, really. I know it's a bit of a cliche, but we had it demonstrated to ourselves, you know, that you really don't need very much in order to be happy. And the number one fundamental thing is that you need to be with the people that make you happy. And if you've got that, you really don't need anything else. So wherever my family is, that's where I'm happiest.
I've so enjoyed speaking to you, Felicity, and I know that we're trying to set up a talk with Steps later on in the year when you're back in the UK. So hopefully many of the listeners will be able to come to that. But in the meantime, they can obviously find the film Exposure and buy your books, The Call of the White, Alone, Life Lessons from Explorers. Are there others? You're obviously working on another one, but any other books they should be reading?
Polar Exposure is the most recent one, and that was about the North Pole expedition, which was written by me and the team. So you get the perspective of the team members as well as my perspective, which I think is great.
And is it a flattering perspective?
It's really...
No,
I think it's a more accurate reflection of the team experience, you know. So in some places you've got two people writing about the exact same incident, and yet you wouldn't recognize it, and you really get to see how quickly misunderstandings turn into you know, a completely different end result. And I think it's a very funny book and a very human book, as well as hopefully inspiring as well.
I'm sure it is. The one last thing that I would love to read is your school report. I wonder what your school report said about you, and whether sort of it predicted this amazing future that you had in the world of exploration and as a research scientist, speaker and author. But that's for another time maybe. But Felicity, thank you hugely for joining us, for taking time away from the Eider Ducks to be with us as an Eider farmer. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so very much.